very short amount of time. Let's dive into a couple of questions before we have to make our exit.
It's a good question. I mean, I really view social justice as linked to human dignity and to the very nature, or the very reality that we're made in the image of God. And so anything that defiles or devalues, someone said that, I think they mentioned devaluing people, but I think anything that devalues that image is something that breaks God's heart. And so, unfortunately, sometimes human rights has been overly defined in secular terms, and certainly, the UN Declaration of Human Rights is a secular document, but it's grounded.
The child.
Exactly.
Where does that fit?
I think it definitely fits. Certainly there's been controversy in the U.S. context about our lack of ratification of the convention. Yeah. And part of that stems from concerns about, I think, exaggerated concerns about what the convention would mean for parenting in America and the ability of a parent to discipline their child. And so some of the challenge in campaigning is correcting misinformation. And that's a real challenge when sometimes the people spreading the misinformation seem to have a megaphone and you have like a small microphone. But it is, a lot of work needs to be done on that front.
Well, the first one is easy. I don't think any arguments have been working because we haven't gotten the results we want. But very simply, the things that seem to have some resonance, putting a sense of scale, something like about 0.6% of our federal budget is on poverty-focused development. It's not a lot of money. We didn't get into this mess by spending too much on the world's poor. It seems to resonate. The other is that it's a smart investment. It's part of our making a better, healthier, safer world. It's probably the best investment we have in our maturity, among other things. I don't know if that is coming across. At the end of the day, we'll see when the decisions are made.
Just to build on that, and I really didn't mention much about World Vision, but I think most of you are familiar with who we are. But we're 60 years old. We celebrated our 60th anniversary last year. We had a relief and development organization that works in 97 different countries on everything from health, education, to community development, to transformation. We did a letter to Congress with about 40 different faith-based organization and denominational signatories, including the NAE. In that letter, we really made a case that these programs are about saving lives, they're cost-effective. There has been bipartisan support, particularly for global health programs in the past. I know times have changed, but we're trying to make sure that stays the same. And this is the argument I think probably made the most difference. We should not be making disproportionate cuts to development assistance programs that save lives, even in an effort to try to balance the budget. So kind of using the point that Galen made that ultimately these are not the big programs that are going to balance our budget. And they were talking about cutting 35% out of humanitarian assistance, emergency humanitarian assistance, whereas they're going to cut 6% out of the entire discretionary budget. So that disproportionality, I think, was an effective argument. I still am trying to figure out how to sway the hearts and minds of Tea Party people. I do think that many of them care about compassion causes, but they're deeply skeptical about the role of government. And we've got to do a better job of explaining why there is a role for government. Government can't do everything. The government partners, when the government partners effectively the private sector and NGOs, incredible things can happen. And 3 million Africans would not be on life-prolonging treatment had it not been for PEPFAR and the Global Fund. And that's a huge success story that I think most people would support and believe in if they really understood how it's happening. To me, the church has not truly stood for some basic principles around a concern for the poor, around measuring the health of our society, around how the weakest and the most marginalized are faring. Now, there are a lot of ways to express a concern for the poor, and again, you can get into these arguments about whether that's the government's role or whether that's the church's role, but I think we at least need to start with some of those core principles, and I don't feel like every Christian is necessarily starting there, or at least emphasizing that. And then to recognize that we got to be driven by the results. So we may not know which is the most effective program or approach, but we know that there is some evidence out there, and we should be measuring whatever approach we take. So if the approach, and I don't want to get overly partisan in this setting, but if the approach has been, to a certain extent, tax cuts for wealthier Americans, let's try to measure the impact of that on the overall economy. And let's take into account the way in which that has made it more difficult to find additional resources for anti-poverty programs. It's probably not the best example, but there's lots of examples like that where, or if we design a program that's going to provide emergency relief to Americans that are in distress, whether through food stamps or unemployment insurance, let's really show through results whether those have been effective. And if they haven't, then let's be honest about that. So I think people on the left sometimes champion a government program regardless of whether it's effective or not, and sometimes people on the right will refuse to acknowledge where there's been effective results. So we got to kind of break out of some of the left-right thinking too.
Christians are disagreeing on, hopefully they're respecting each other and not claiming authority over each other. And I think that's really important for members of Congress and decision makers, policymakers to know that there's a community there that's not divided.
Yeah, and just one last thing on that. That's a good point. When I say more authority, I'm not saying you go into a member's office and say, I am speaking for God. You say, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but just to clarify, you're saying, I'm inspired by my faith, and my faith tells me that God has a particular concern for the poor. And right now we know poverty numbers are going up. Here are some programs we think are effective. So it's appealing to the shared values and the shared priorities of our faith tradition, rather than the kind of heavy-handed, overbearing. I'm on God's side here.
Larry, because as a former World Vision, you must be in the D.C. office.
I am, yeah.
Where else? Not out there. AC.
Times are changing. Go ahead.
One of the things that I see, and you're talking, and this comes, you're from Atlanta, Carter Center, with the task force now for global health, has been striving for real collaboration, they call it. What it takes to make global health succeed. They did that. It's a marvelous workshop. Jimmy's there, everybody's there. And that was 2006. In 2010, they published the book, but there's an incredible CD-ROM. You don't have to read the book. I did, but it's even better put out here. And what they're saying is that, including you faith-based groups, you're just competing. Just park the egos at the door. And we're missing NDGs. There's the urgency issue, big time. But nothing has moved on the recommendations that came out in 2006. Because I talked to Mark Rosenberg just the other day, and he said, what can we do? Well, one thing is they never tapped into the people in these countries who they're trying to help, and they're getting all organized now. We just tune into BBC and see what's happening every day. So I was saying, what is it that you're saying, and I know you're domestic focused, but that is really dealing with this issue among the faith-based groups themselves, instead of, saying we're all together in the gospel? I mean, they're just divisive among each other, trying to get into the CNN camera views when there's a catastrophe someplace and show their logos.
It's a fair point that there is real, sometimes healthy, sometimes unhealthy competition between NGOs, even Christian NGOs, for that matter. But I do think there's a lot more collaboration than maybe you realize. I mean, when it comes to advocacy, we work through a number of different coalitions, some faith-based, some faith-based and beyond, whether it's Interaction, which is kind of the largest consortium of development-related agencies, or the U.S. Global Leadership Council, which combines corporate actors alongside faith-based actors and even former generals, or some of the kind of bilateral cooperation between us and CRS, who've been doing a lot of advocacy with our Catholic partner agency, with World Leaf, etc. So there is a lot of cooperation that happens, particularly in trying to amplify our message, because even as big as World Vision is, we can't do it alone, and we need to work with other constituencies in order to amplify our voice and our influence. But more needs to be done.